Hello and welcome to this video on monopsony in the labour market. So in this video we're going to look at what is meant by the term monopsony and then illustrate the impact that a monopsony labour market may have in terms of wages and employment. So previously we've looked at labour markets and we've assumed that they're operating in perfect competition. So the wages in the market are determined by the industry as a whole. As we can see here on the left hand side, we have the demand for labour, the supply of labour, and we have the current industry wage rate. That means for an individual firm, they have to take the wage rate that's currently being charged. If they were to try and charge a lower wage rate, they would lose all of their workers. So we would say in a perfectly competitive labour market, for the individual firm, they are a wage taker. They have to take the current market wage. And the supply of labour is perfectly inelastic. So the firm will decide to employ up until the point where the marginal revenue product equals the current wage rate. So here they would choose to employ Q numbers of workers and pay them all a wage of W, which is the going wage in the labour market. So sometimes labour markets are imperfectly competitive. Now this may be because of imperfect information, or maybe because of geographical or occupational immobility of labour that we've looked at last time. It could also be because of a monopsony situation, which we'll come on to a second. But where there are imperfections in the wage mechanism, the implications of this are that firms don't just take the industry wage, actually firms have some wage setting power. So if they charge a lower wage, they don't necessarily lose all of their workers. In fact, they have some control over the wages they set. So the supply of labour is not perfectly elastic for the individual firm, which we can see here. Now, one of the reasons why we often have an imperfectly competitive labour market is because of the existence of monopsony. Now, this is an important definition. A monopsony occurs where there is a sole or dominant employer in a labour market. So workers don't really have much choice who they work for. And as a result, firms can therefore charge lower wages and not lose all of their workers. So the employer has some buying power over their potential employees, which gives them some wage setting power. And this is a potential cause of a labour market failure. So in a monopsony, we have the supply curve of labour, which effectively is the average cost of labour, saying on average, how much do I have to pay to get that number of workers? To attract new workers, the firm will have to increase wages, and if they don't want as many workers, then they can reduce wages. Now, as we'll see in a second, the wage they pay might not necessarily reflect the marginal revenue product of the people employed as it would do in a perfectly competitive market. Some examples of monopsony where we just have a sole or single buyer in the market might be things like the National Health Service. If you're a doctor or a nurse, really there's only one employer in the market, or one dominant employer aside from private healthcare. The army would be a good example. There's just one employer there, so they have control, they have wage setting power. Now let's have a look at some analysis here for the monopsony employer. So we're going to look at from our business's perspective. We have the demand for labour, which is linked to the marginal revenue product. So here, as we've got diminishing returns from labour, the marginal revenue product that we're getting for each worker is decreasing, which dictates the demand for labour. We also have the average cost of labour, and the wage rate here is not one horizontal labour supply, perfectly elastic. We have to take the wage rate. We have some wage setting power. So if we increase wages, then we can hire more people. If we reduce wages, we don't lose all of our workers. Now, if we have the average cost of labour, we also have the marginal cost of labour. So this is the extra cost that comes about from adding an additional worker. So for example, here, if I wanted to hire one worker around here, I would have to pay them a certain amount of money here, the wage right at the bottom. If I wanted to then hire a second worker, I'd have to increase the wage. So actually that second worker will be increasing my labour costs by more than just the wage I'd have to pay the second worker and now the first worker by. So it's kind of the opposite, if you like, of our average revenue and marginal revenue from before. Effectively saying this is the average we were paying our staff to get this many staff. So to get E1, we have to pay W1, but the E1th worker will add more to our total labour costs because by attracting that extra worker, we've had to increase wages for all the previous workers that have gone before. So now if we think from this firm's perspective, what is the profit maximizing level of employment? Well, the demand for labour comes from the marginal revenue product of labour. So how much extra revenue does each worker bring me? And I need to compare that with how much extra cost, the marginal cost of labour, each worker brings me. And so up until this point here at W2, the marginal revenue product, each extra bit of revenue the workers give me, is greater than the additional cost they add onto my wage bill. So I'm happy to hire all the workers up until E2 because what they bring in is greater than the cost. Beyond E2, I wouldn't hire these workers because the marginal revenue product they bring in is less than the marginal cost of labour. Now, I don't actually have to pay all the workers W2. To find out how much I need to pay in order to attract E2 amount of workers, I go down to my labour supply curve and I find that I pay the workers W3, wage 3, to attract E2 levels of workers. So my total wages are W3 times E2. However, the wages those workers are bringing in a revenue product of W2. So in imperfectly competitive markets, the marginal revenue product does not equal the wage rate that we're paying our workers. In fact, here we can afford to underpay them based on the amount of revenue they're bringing into the business. There is also a deadweight loss here because these additional workers from E2 to E1 are not being hired, even though the marginal revenue product for those workers is greater than the wage rate I'd have to pay out. So the moral of this story here on the right hand side is that the monopsony employer could use their buying power to pay a wage lower than the value of the marginal revenue product of workers employed at E2. So they can pay W3 even though the workers are bringing in extra revenue of W2. So in this sense, when we have monopsony in the labour market, it can lead to exploitation of employed workers. What they're being paid is not equivalent to the revenue that they're bringing in. And this can lead to a dead weight loss when compared to the outcome that would be the case under a perfectly competitive market, where we would get a wage rate of W1 and E1 levels of employment. Final part of the story is to look at what the impact of a national minimum wage might be and why we might suggest this is relevant or desirable from an economic viewpoint where we have monopsony in our labour market. So if we were to set a national minimum wage above W3, so W min here, so the national minimum wage, we cannot charge below W min until the point actually here to E4, whereas after that, the national minimum wage doesn't apply anymore because the actual market wage has gone above this point, and so we then get our marginal cost of labour curve as it was before from this point here at half the gradient. Now, what would be the impact on this market? Well, now actually the firm, to look at where the marginal cost of labour equals the marginal revenue product of labour, would move to this point here. So we'd now have E3 workers employed at the minimum wage. So we now have a higher employment level and also a higher wage being paid. So this underpins why you might argue that a minimum wage actually can stop the exploitation of workers, which is more desirable and reduces the dead weight loss that we had previously. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by monopsony. We've illustrated how monopsony may impact the labour market. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.